Good evening. I'm Jim Gardner, Executive for Legislative Archives, Presidential Libraries, and Museum Services here at the National Archives. And it's my pleasure to welcome you to the William G. McGowan Theater for tonight's special program with acclaimed historical artist Mort Künstler. We're honored to have Mr. Künstler here with us tonight, and we'll shortly welcome him and Laurie Norton Moffatt, Director and CEO of the Norman Rockwell Museum, who will interview Mort on stage and take us on an illustrated journey through his distinguished career as America's premier historical artist. Tonight's program is presented in partnership with the Congressional Battlefield Caucus. And I would like to thank our next speaker for suggesting bringing Mr. Künstler to the National Archives. Congressman Steve Israel represents New York's 2nd Congressional District, including the communities of Huntington, Babylon, Islip, Smithtown, and Oyster Bay. He was first sworn into Congress in 2001. The Congressman is a member of the House leadership, serving as the chairman of the Democratic Congressional Campaign Committee. In March of 2012, he was appointed to the U.S. Holocaust Memorial Council, serving with 7 other members of Congress. With a serious passion for military history, a congressman formed the Congressional Battlefield Caucus during the 109th Congress and continues the tradition through today. Israel has been a passionate and relentless advocate for veterans and military families throughout his tenure in Congress. He served for 4 years on the House Armed Services Committee and has made 9 visits to U.S. troops in Iraq and Afghanistan. Congressman Israel.
Thank you all very, very much. Thank you, Jim Gardner, for the extraordinary work that you do. And I know that my dear colleague, Roscoe Bartlett, representative from Maryland, is on his way. Votes just ended, so we're running a little bit late, but Roscoe told me that he was planning to join us. It's also great to be here with Paul Hawk, who's the chief of the American Battlefield Protection Program, and Bill Vadra from the Civil War Trust, and my wonderful friend, who many of you may not know, but I hope you will get to know, Tom Swazi. Tom was a county executive in my hometown and ran for governor, did an extraordinary job, but also has one of the deepest commitments to history and education that I've ever seen. And he was the guy who actually introduced me to Mort. He just accompanied me to a trip that we made to Gettysburg. So Mort being here today is nothing that I did, or quite honestly, nothing that the archives did, but it is everything that Tom Swazi did to bring him here. I'm going to be very brief because we want to hear from Mort. He's waiting backstage. He's excited to come out here, and you want to hear from him and not me. So let me make a couple of quick points to set the stage for Mort's discussion. I'll tell you a story about how Congress operates and how I fell in love with the history of the Civil War. I have never claimed to be the smartest member of the United States Congress, although if you listen to some of my colleagues, you know the competition ain't that stiff. But I do immodestly claim to be the most serious student of history and military history in particular. I am a voracious student of military history. I wrote a book on military history, which made history by itself as being one of the worst sellers ever on Amazon.com. I just love history. And here's how I became almost obsessed with the lessons of the Civil War. I used to be on the House Armed Services Committee. And I noticed something after several years on that committee. Generals and admirals would come in to testify, and they would read from their testimony, and it was usually fairly sterile and somewhat bland. But if you developed a kinship with them, if you built a relationship with them, if they began to feel some faith in you and have some confidence in your ability to listen to what they were saying and not repeat it to the media, they would give you the real deal. And so I made a point after senior military officials would testify of getting to know them, having them come up to my office and visiting with them and having dinner with them or coffee. And I became friendly with this one general, General Bob Scales, who was the commandant of the U.S. Army War College in Carlisle. And he came to testify on Iraq. At the time, mostly everything that we were doing in Iraq was going wrong. This was at the height of the violence and the insurrection. And Bob testified, and I called him up and said, Bob, would you mind coming to my office and talking a little bit more about your testimony? He said, sure, I'd love to. And he came to my office and closed the door, and I thought he was going to pull the drapes and take the phones off the hook. And he said, Congressman, he said, do you want to know what's going wrong in Iraq? And I said, Bob, please tell me. He said, well, I would like to tell you, but I'd have to take you. And I'd just been to Iraq, literally a month before, been there 9 times. I said, General, I just came back from Iraq. I can't go there so soon. And he said, oh, no, Congressman. I don't want to take you to Iraq to understand Iraq. I want to take you to Gettysburg to understand Iraq. Because everything you need to know about strategy, doctrine, tactics, communication, operational art, everything you need to know about Iraq, I can show you in a day in Gettysburg. And so I went with him. And we spent a day there. And it changed my life. I mean, it changed my life. Because I came back understanding that the lessons of history really do repeat themselves and guide our future. Now, here's how Congress operates. So I decided, based on that visit, Jim, to Gettysburg, that I was going to form the House Civil War Caucus. You know, we have caucuses on almost everything, and that's okay. You know, members of Congress on both sides of the aisle, you have areas of interest, some arcane and some significant. If you have an area of interest, you try and get like-minded members of Congress to focus on those areas. So I decided I was going to form the House Civil War Caucus to teach my colleagues the lessons of the Civil War so that they would understand what we needed to do in Iraq, Afghanistan, and elsewhere. And I was getting a great response. I was getting Democrats and Republicans, conservatives, liberals. Great response. People were signing up for the House Civil War Caucus like crazy. And then I realized that I committed a mortal sin. I had forgotten to ask the ranking member of the Armed Services Committee, Ike Skelton, who was my boss on the committee, to join my House Civil War Caucus. And that's a serious blunder, because as you know, everything in Congress is based on seniority. And so I found Ike on the floor one day. Some of you may remember. Ike was just the greatest military historian in the Congress and the father of professional military education. I found him on the floor one day, and I sat next to him. I said, Ike, you know, I have like a total of 3 terms under my belt. Ike has a total of 3 decades under his belt. I said, Ike, I have formed the Civil War Caucus, and I would like you to sign up for it. Now, Ike is from Missouri, and he sat next to me, and he peered over his glasses, and he said, Israel, I will join your Civil War Caucus when you call it the War of Northern Aggression Caucus. And so we talked about it, and we compromised, and today it is known as the Civil War Battlefield Caucus. So you don't have to pick sides. Final point about Mort. I have proudly hanging in my office his rendition of Chamberlain at Little Round Top. Tom Swazi and I visited Little Round Top just a few weeks ago. And it's just a marvelous, marvelous painting of Joshua Lawrence Chamberlain and the 20th Maine at Little Round Top, and that moment where Chamberlain was reported to have simply said, "Fix bayonets, charge." And when people come into my office, and I don't care who they are, constituents or my colleagues or candidates, and they talk about how hard things are and what an uphill battle it's going to be and how rough it is, I point to that painting and say, we got it easy. Look what they had to deal with. That's hard. What we deal with, it's easy. If they can do that, we can do this. And so I'm very happy to say that Mort Künstler inspires me every single day and inspires my colleagues and people who come into my office. It is a unique privilege to be able to represent Mort and to reflect his central mission, and that is preservation. Our future is guided by the preservation of the past, and nobody has preserved the past in more visible and more dramatic and more compelling forms than Mort Künstler. Thank you for spending the evening with him. I know that you're going to learn a lot. Thank you all very much.
Now it's my pleasure to introduce the participants in our program this evening. Mort Künstler is a leading contemporary painter of Civil War scenes. His work is valued for its dramatic intensity and for an extraordinary level of authenticity based on extensive historical research. He studied art at Brooklyn College, UCLA, and the Pratt Institute, worked as an illustrator for Newsweek, Saturday Evening Post, Mad Magazine, and Boy's Life, and then moved to depictions of historical topics for National Geographic. A commission from CBS TV to do artwork for the miniseries The Blue and the Gray sparked his close association with the Civil War. Joining him on the stage this evening will be Laurie Norton Moffatt. She is director, CEO of the Norman Rockwell Museum. Ms. Norton Moffatt is a leading Rockwell scholar and authored Norman Rockwell, A Definitive Catalog. She oversaw the expansion of the Norman Rockwell Museum, which opened its new Robert A.M. Stern building in 1993. During her tenure, she has invited national reconsideration of Rockwell in the American art history canon and initiated discourse on the role of American illustration in the nation's visual culture. She is the founding vision behind the Rockwell Center for American Visual Studies, a scholars research program of the Rockwell Museum. Now, be joined by Mr. Künstler and Ms. Norton Moffatt.
Oh my God. Thank you.
Good evening. We have an image. Well, Mort, we're going to have a conversation tonight about your art and your life and I think the history of this country. You are considered America's foremost painter of historic and heroic subjects. And you have painted and learned the history of this nation from the Revolutionary War to the space shuttle flying up into the sky. You've painted from the depths of Submarine on the bottom of the ocean to the moon. And you are especially known for your work chronicling the Civil War and being a painter of America's history. So let's see where it all began when you were a child in Brooklyn and how you came to be the painter of this country's history. Okay. So we have some early drawings. You want to tell us about these?
Sure. Well, whether I was fortunate or not, I don't know, but I was a sickly kid, and it kept me in my room and in my bed. And this is a very early drawing that I did of my room from the bed, as you could see. I think I was probably about 6 years old at the time. And there were a few other pictures on the...
When did you discover that you liked to draw and, really, were you always given art supplies? How did you come to be, having these early sketches and keeping them all your life?
Well, I think that I showed a talent at an early age. My father... the name Künstler means artist in German.
Artist, yes.
So obviously it goes back, and I have my genes to be thankful for. And my mother encouraged me. This picture we're looking at is also a childhood picture. The first time I ever painted a picture it was a copy of a painting that was on the wall in our house. And for some reason, my father had original art in our house, too. Small little paintings by unknown artists. And he was an amateur artist.
So
And,
when did you actually start your art training? Did you train formally in school?
Well, I certainly did. I went through 3 different colleges specializing in art. This picture is another childhood picture that's interesting. Growing up in Brooklyn, I was a big Dodger fan. And I used to copy the pictures out of the newspapers of the Dodgers. And I finally put them all together on an 18 by 24 sheet. And through some sort of circumstances via an uncle who knew one of the ball players, I was allowed into the clubhouse, and they all picked their images out and signed them. So this picture is probably one of my most valuable paintings because it's got the signatures of Hall of Fame guys on there and that sort
doubly
of thing.
famous.
I did a whole bunch of them for 3 years running.
Well, I understand your father wanted to raise you both as an artist and an athlete. How do you feel do you feel that your athleticism helped you understand the adventure scenes that you came to paint later in life?
I think that I certainly had an athletic career, but I really don't know. I don't know. I think I have a feel for action without question. I gained that. These pictures we're looking at here are the one before in the suit of armor was a picture that I painted in the at the Metropolitan Museum of Art when I was going to Pratt. And the following picture shows me on a trip where I went to Mexico and painted a watercolor every day. I rode around Mexico on a bicycle, as a matter of fact, and stopped on the road. Here's another watercolor that was done in Veracruz, as I remember. And I ended up very adept at watercolor at the end of the summer. I did at least one watercolor every day.
You did a picture a day?
And I was in great physical shape besides, because Mexico is just up one mountain
One
and down
hill after
another,
another.
and up and down. This is another watercolor from Mexico of the city or town of Tasco. That's a very famous spot. It was a very famous tourist spot at one time.
So when you finished your time in Mexico and finished art school, you began to work for the magazines. Tell us a little bit about what illustration art was like at that time in the publishing world and for artists, and what kind of commissions you received.
Well, the natural thing I wanted was to paint pictures for a living. It was the only goal I had. And I just figured out that if I went for the least expensive art, or looked and saw where art was done, where I felt I could do better, I would show my samples to the art director. And at that time, the men's adventure field was burgeoning, you might say, and it had a whole hierarchy of its own. At the top of the line was True magazine that had writers. This is a True an illustration for True. It was my very first one, as a matter of fact. And they had writers like Ernest Hemingway and Sax Rohmer, and it was quite prestigious to get there. And then they had the lower end. I worked my way up through that system, so to speak, and to where I was doing fairly well with it.
And this,
I did book covers as well.
This became
and sports became something. Another area of painting was the box covers for the plastic kit companies, like Aurora Plastics. This picture of an F-6F Wildcat from World War II is just symbolic of a whole bunch that I did, of almost every aircraft that ever flew.
So this might have been the beginning of the historical accuracy and attention to detail that you had to give to paint
I never
these
realized it at
so
the time.
accurately.
Yes, I think it probably is so. Absolutely. These pictures are of the Men from Uncle, and they were also box covers for Aurora Plastics.
At the same time.
I did, I think, more of those than any other artist, about 70 or 80 of them, and they've become a collectible now. I guess if you stick around long enough, the works are collected by people.
They're all collected. So this men's adventure category of art, who was reading that? Who was the audience for this work?
Well, here we go again with more of the plastic covers, but this is a sort of part of the subject matter. Outdoor life, I believe, still exists. And the subject matter was such that you had to be good at certain things, and the more varied you were, the better off you were.
So what did you
So
have
I
to be
became
good
pretty
at?
good with bears.
Bears, I know.
And,
look at this bear. Look
I
at
became good with the big cats, and that was a big category. And there was sports afield that I did a lot of work for. There was outdoor life.
Ooh, and then there was pulp fiction,
And then I
yes?
became very good at bears, B-A-R-E-S. So that added another category.
This was another category.
Between the two bears that I was working away. And
this
anyway,
was a very popular genre at the time, the pulp fiction and all of the
absolutely.
art of that time.
This is a typical one, aviation, again, which was box cover, so it fit naturally. And a picture of this type, if you could divide the picture in half, You would see where there was room for the fold and there were blank areas for the copy and text. So designing these illustrations was not an easy task. And it was more or less the same problems Michelangelo faced, believe it or not, except his page size was different.
He had to fit into
And
those
he
ceiling
worked upside
poppers like
down,
up
right.
here. So you were given direction. You had to leave room for the copy. You had to make it fit the layout of
You
the
had to,
the
you
box
had to
and
allow for the
magazine.
fold so that there was nothing of special interest right in the middle. You had to allow for the title and the copy and making it dramatic. And I just sort of felt that if I could make it as exciting as possible, that was the key to it.
So what
And
were-
it led from one picture to another. World War II was a very popular subject.
Yes, you did many in the World War II inspired stories. Was this a popular subject matter in the literature at the time that you were painting?
I would say that it was certainly popular with the men's adventure magazines, that the titles, the stories also ran in other magazines, so I use it as a broad term. I did some work for the Saturday Evening Post, for Good Housekeeping, and American Weekly I did an awful lot of work for, and I was always called on for some reason to do the mystery, or I guess I had a knack for it. But World War II was a very popular subject with the readers, and without trying to name drop, Mario Puzo, the famous author of The Godfather, was an editor, and we were quite friendly, and he used to say that World War II was the good war, not for any moral reasons, but that it sold.
People wanted to read the stories.
And he said that Korea was the bad war and Vietnam was the bad war. But it was strictly readership and what they wrote back about that he was interested in at the
Well,
time.
and the other aspect that was changing during those later wars was television was taking readership away from the magazines and
Well,
changing the field considerably, wasn't it?
That certainly changed everything. Television money went, the money that went into the print media was now going into television.
The
So people were
advertising,
starting to get their
yes.
fiction over television. And this is a string of World War II pictures that we're looking at now. And I always did seek accuracy, of course. And it was fairly easy because the armed forces had public relations officers, and I always found their office, and they helped me in whatever way they could. And the Marines were especially good. I remember one time they sent a Marine over with a M1 or I forget. And I also, to make sure the pictures were authentic, I began collecting weapons and costumes. I had all sorts
That's a
of
great
costumes and props.
tradition for many artists to have a costume collection or the props and objects. Norman Rockwell did, for example.
Well-
And so you have such varied subject matter. What kinds of costumes and
Well-
props do you have?
Well, for the World War II period, I had whatever I could. I'd go to gun shows and buy them. And as a matter of fact, I even had a Tommy gun at one time, which was became illegal. But I eventually sold.
The Künstler
sold
arsenal.
But it makes it so much easier to make it authentic, of course, and it was kind of fun. But I sold all of it once I stopped doing the World War II illustrations. They sat in a storeroom until I said, "What do I need this for?"
Someone
and there are
else
always people
can use
or
them.
dealers that are willing to come and buy whatever you have. so-
Collect, other collectors,
And
yes.
I have not collected Civil War stuff at all. Just, no, I shouldn't say that. I have quite a number of weapons, of course I have. Right. This is World War II. Again, this is a picture of D-Day. The one before was a different layout, the one with the red background that we just saw. That was a vertical picture of Zero's kamikaze planes attacking an American battleship. It's a vertical because that was a paperback cover. And the paperback company saw these illustrations and called me, and
So
I did various covers for them.
Let's talk about that a little bit, the range of media, if you will, that your images were reproduced on. You had the magazines, the paperback books, the box covers you were talking about. Any other kinds of printed
Well,
material
I did
you were on?
some advertising, but not very much. Just about it. I was not soliciting work anymore, and people would
You
come
were,
to me.
I understand you were working 12, 16-hour days for a while.
Yeah,
Like
record
for
for
many
me was, I guess,
years.
every day for 6 or 7 weeks, 12 hours minimum. That's long time.
That's a long time.
But I have to say that I really loved it, and it was almost a compulsion. I couldn't believe I was making a living painting pictures, first of all, and I was just afraid it was going to go away, so it was never a deadline I would miss.
But I understand there was a time when your family said, we need some of your time as well, and you were able to balance your work patterns a little more after that.
Well, that led to, Debbie had bought, Debbie, can you stand up? Okay. All right. She's here. She was
Welcome,
ready to
Debbie.
leave me, and because it was just ridiculous. She had bought tickets for a show in New York, and it was a Saturday night probably, and I said, I can't, I've got to work tonight and tomorrow, and she really got angry at me, and we went to the show, and I found out that on Monday that I was supposed to deliver the painting on Monday, and I called on Monday morning and said, do you want it today and bad, or tomorrow and good? And so they gave me an extra day, and I really worked hard all day Sunday and Sunday night. I couldn't make it, and I got it in there on Tuesday, delivered it, and they called, and they gave me another painting to do, and they gave me another urgent deadline, and 2 weeks later I came in with the cover painting for Argosy, I think it was, and there was the cover that was in such distress and so late, still sitting on an easel in his office. I began to realize that these guys were just covering themselves and making sure they were not going to be late for the printer. So I began to realize that it wasn't life or death all the time.
So I
You
think
didn't have
this
to believe them.
was an important turning point for you, actually, to gain better life balance, have time for your family, your children, and
Yes.
still be the fabulous artist and in
Yes.
demand that you were by that time.
Yes, yes.
And I think, I worked a lot with Norman Rockwell's life and career, and he too was compelled to paint all the time, and hardly took time out for birthdays or Christmas, and was back to the studio. And I think that's a quality of our best artists, that they're just driven to paint, and it's what you do and it's what you love, and it's, I'm sure, wonderful that your family understands that. And
Well, what it led to was a great adventure for us, because we finally decided that people were seeking my work so much, and I was only in the field about 10 years. We moved to Mexico. We had been there on our honeymoon and liked it. We'd been there on an auto trip the following summer. We took off, and then once we started to have children, we said, gee, it's not necessary to paint all the time. And we literally moved down there.
how long did you live there?
And we lived there for almost 2 years with our 3 children. And it's probably some
What
of
a
the
great
happiest
adventure.
days we ever had. And we began to realize, though, that we were going to be foreigners. Our kids were starting to talk in Spanish to each other, and they would play under the dining room table.
And you couldn't understand
in
them, huh?
Spanish. No, I spoke Spanish pretty well. I could understand them all right, but I think that there was just a sense that we had to go
Had to
back
come
home. And
back.
when we moved, we said we were going to give it from 6 months to forever. And the 6 months turned into a year
Couple of
and a half or so.
years. And what year was that you were there?
1961 to 63.
So that was another, these are just a few more of your adventure.
This one was
scenes.
for Saturday Evening Post.
A little more family, wholesome style there.
Yeah, but it was the same period, and this is a
And here's one of
Sports
your-
Afield cover. You could see the title, if you could imagine it, saying Sports Afield across the top area. That's why it's sort of blank up on the top.
So you're charging Tiger.
This was an interesting picture. It's the Homestead Steel Strike, and it was done for True magazine, which is sort of the top of the line of the adventure magazines. And it was a very famous strike, and famous in Union history. The Pinkertons broke the strike with Winchesters. They came up in a barge, just the way you see it. It was one of the early paintings I did that you can see the hallmark of a lot of my work today, where it's sort of putting little pieces together and creating a lot of different characters.
A lot of activity
and
going
that's
on.
kind of what I love to do, I think.
And
is
I
to
noticed
create
in your work
people.
that your people are very individualized. They're each a different person. They're not a type. You take the time to paint individual faces.
Well, I use the same model for every picture, interestingly, and I change their builds, I change their I'll use whatever it takes to get to the final result. But the creative part of making up the characters is something I
Part of
really
the
cherish to
storytelling.
this day, and I love painting pictures of famous personalities in angles that no photo exists. And it's, I guess, something that interests me a great deal.
We'll
and I've
talk
gotten
about
pretty
that
proficient at it.
in one of your pictures coming up. Now,
This
this
is another
interested
World
me.
War II picture. This was for Argosy, another very good magazine. I remember, I don't think it was Philip Wiley was.
Well, I understand that the Secret Service came to you to commission
Right,
this.
yes, yes.
Tell us about that.
Well, what it was a story illustration, and it was exhibited in a show, some gallery or college, university, I think, a gallery, on World War II, on the anniversary of World War II, and this was one of the pictures. And shortly after, I got a call from the Secret Service. And I said, what did I do? I mean, you hear from the Secret Service. And it turned out that it's the first time they'd ever seen a picture of counterfeiting, and this was a famous case that they had, and that they had broken successfully. And they inquired about it, and they ended up actually, a group of Secret Servicemen bought it, and then eventually gave it as a gift to the Secret Service, and it hangs in Washington.
Remarkable.
At the headquarters to this day.
And I understand you told them you had a little bit of experience with counterfeiting and shook them up for a moment.
Yes. Well, they took me out to dinner. Boy, you're remembering my dark past. They took me out to dinner, and they were telling me about the case and how excited they were. And prints were made, 150 limited edition prints were made. I think there were 150 offices in the Secret Service at that time in the United States, and they had a print
you're in
made for
every
each office, and I
office.
signed them. And they brought me down to Washington for a presentation, and I still couldn't get over this, and a Secret Service man accompanied me down to Washington. And I couldn't get over it, but it seems that that was the only way I could go, is if a Secret Service man took me and accompanied me. And later, after the presentation, they took me out to dinner, and I said, you know, I was a counterfeiter once. And their jaws dropped, you know, and they really said, "Oh no, but he doesn't realize." They told me later.
Now they thought
he doesn't
that's
realize
how
that he's going to be accountable for everything he says. We're going to have to lock this guy up. I said, "Yeah, you know, when I was about 8 years old, they had the Knothole Club at Ebbets Field for the Brooklyn Dodgers, and they had little cards for the kids that they gave out in school, and they were color-coded. One would be yellow, one would be pink, one would be blue. And if your best friend had a blue one and you had a pink one, you couldn't go to the game together. So I got cardboard and I put watercolor on, and I counterfeited the Knothole tickets. And then I finally made it into a business. I probably got a penny, or I once said I got a dime to one of my friends. I said, "Are you kidding? Who had a dime?" So it might have been a nickel, I don't know. But that was my counterfeiting job, so they all relaxed after that.
So you're
laughed, and
okay.
I didn't
let
go
you
to jail.
keep painting. Well, we see your work change a little bit in the 1960s, quite a lot actually. You took an assignment with National Geographic, and you had a completely different kind of commission than you'd had previously.
Well, the experience was totally different in that a true magazine always wanted the truth and as accurate as possible, but within limitations. I could go to New London to get on board a submarine and see what it looked like if it was a submarine scene. But the Geographic would go to there was nothing they would do that would cost too much. They would send you anywhere to get it right. And this picture that we're looking at is the discovery of San Francisco Bay. A Spanish expedition with Mexican soldiers, soldados de cuera, leather-jacketed soldiers and leather armor, marched up from Mexico aiming for Monterey and overshot Monterey. And in fact, any of you who have been to San Francisco might be familiar with Portola Boulevard. This is Gaspar de Portola discovering the San Francisco Bay, and that's Mount Diablo across the bay. And I actually visited the site, which the marshland that you see in the painting overlooks the airport at San Francisco to this day, of course. And I then went to Tucson, Arizona to consult with an authority on the leather jacketed armor and the uniforms. He was the expert on that expedition. And what resulted from that is I presented the Geographic painting before I delivered it to an agent by the name of Laverty, Frank Laverty, and Frank and Jeff Laverty became my agents for art, and it put me into the world of advertising art. There are thousands of advertising agencies all over, and there's no way that an artist is going to be able to solicit for that kind of work. And it was always a very desirable field. In Norman Rockwell's day, they vowed to not do advertising. They thought it was not the right thing to do. They felt story illustration was more important when there were story illustrations to do.
Well, we have some advertising art coming up. Let's go to it. And,
this is an interesting piece here, the advertising art, because it brings back my old friend Mario Puzo. This picture was done for the Literary Guild, which I don't know if they exist or not. I don't know if the Book of the Month Club exists anymore.
I
live in such an isolated
it's probably
zone.
downloaded electronically now.
But this is, the movie came out in '73, and I did the very first pictorial version of The Godfather for, I think it was Mail magazine, who Mario was an editor for. And then when the book was picked up by the Literary Guild, I created this character after reading the script. The first one was done off a paragraph, totally different character. But I think you could see, this was done in '69, the movie in '73, and I was told that this was the criteria for the Marlon Brando character.
For the,
and I think you can see
film.
it in there. So it's kind of a unique picture that I had a lot of fun.
I think that's interesting about your work, that you were working at a time that you were working in the intersections of film and print and books and television, product, advertising, and that illustration was inspiring and infusing all of those media. And you were moving back and forth in this, all the different genres.
I always thought of them as painting pictures. It didn't matter where they appeared. I just love doing this. Newsweek used me a good number of times, and they would not use art very often. But it was usually when there was an event that took place and they could not get photographs. They would almost always want to use a photograph, and they wanted their own photograph, so they would not use a stock photo. So that in this particular situation, obviously, you couldn't get a photograph like that. This is a natural for a Newsweek cover, and I think there are some others coming up. This, interestingly, was
this could
in the
be
70s.
As contemporary as today.
Yeah,
sadly.
exactly. And this was the West German at the time raid on Mogadishu, where hijackers had landed an airliner, and they went in. The art director at Newsweek always called it the Entebbe raid, but it wasn't. It was the Entebbe-like raid on Mogadishu by the West Germans, and it was more successful, actually, because they killed all the terrorists but did not wound a single passenger that was held hostage. And I figured out how they did it by going to the airport and getting permission on an angle that would be dramatic for that cover. And I could see just how the West Germans came up from the rear. There was a blind spot from the cabin, even with a mirror, where you could single file come up and then come out.
And that's the
under.
angle you
And I didn't take
chose
that
your
exact
picture from.
angle, but I realized that was the way it was done. This is an interesting picture. It was done in 1975 for the bicentennial of our country. It appeared in 1976. It was on the cover of Army magazine. That was, I know, still published today, and I was down to Washington to confer with them on it, and it was also used as a limited edition print. And interestingly, this is a painting that Debbie owns, and it's a very masculine-looking picture, I think, and kind that men would be.
It's a very patriotic picture.
Appeal to, but she just happened to love that picture, and she took it out of a very early show of mine. And,
well, we have a few end of the magazine era images to look through here.
This is a kind of interesting story. I was called via my agent to do a Mad magazine cover, And I said, come on, I'm not going to do that stuff. And I turned him down, and at dinner that night, I mentioned it, and Jane was at the table, and Jane, can you raise your...
Hi, Jane.
And when she heard I turned down a Mad cover, she almost got hysterical.
Oh, Dad.
She said, I could have been the big shot in high school. And she practically cried, so I called him back and said, hey, get me a cover, but I'm going to do it under a different name. And I worked under a lot of different names.
So what names have you painted under?
I painted under Emmett K., which is my initials, Emmett K, M-K. I painted under Martin K, I guess, and Mort Künstler, and Morts.
So who did this?
Morts.
Morts did this?
Yeah, M-U-T-Z. And they did a parody of this cover. It became a sort of an iconic
And what year
image
was
for-
this? Do you remember?
Mad Magazine did a parody of it themselves in a special issue, and they had the signature as nuts.
1976. So,
Yeah.
so did this
And they
precede...
must have done it, at the end of a decade or so. It was picked out.
I'm trying to remember if this preceded or followed Jaws. I
Oh,
think-
this was, of course, after Jaws, right. And what happened is I recognized, by the way, that would have collectible value. Finally, I began to realize that the originals would have some sort of collectible value. And I would have done them, actually, because they paid me very well and they were fun. But they refused to return the art, so I said, forget it. And the
You're also
advertising art, of
working on
course, I had
advertising
no
art.
back to bears.
See, everything comes into hand.
But what's interesting is each one of these pictures recognizes, you have to realize, represents literally 100 or 200 similar images. I can't say I did 100 billboards, but I certainly did a couple of dozen.
You did many
Here are
commissions
some
for
of the
same
movies that I've
advertisement.
done
Yeah.
that were very much sought after. They were very much sought after by almost every illustrator. They first of all went worldwide. And they,
Now,
of
did you
course,
watch
paid very
these
well, and
movies before
it was
you
very
did the art?
competitive.
Did you watch the movies before you created these
Well,
movie posters?
some of
or
them we watched half-hour or 20-minute synopses.
Trailers?
Yeah, I guess you'd call them trailers. And the one we're looking at became so popular that it was redone. The Take Me Pelham 1, 2, 3. Same with the Poseidon Adventure. But we would watch sometimes. I understand this is a bit of a classic too. It has a bunch of people that are interested in it. But they were just what they were. They were a lot of fun, and they sure paid the bills. And I always enjoyed doing them. This changed
This was
things
a real
for me.
turning point painting for you, wasn't it, Mort?
Well, this was an assignment, as I recall, from Reader's Digest as a test project for an Indian book. And it changed things for me because of the subject matter. And it was going to be a series of paintings on ceremonials that had never really been done before, rare ceremonials. And this is called a potlatch ceremony, where one tribe of the Haida Indian, the northwest coast, arrived at another village. And it just happened by coincidence. I had the painting under my arm, wrapped up, and I went to a show at Hammer Galleries. And a friend of mine had a show there, and I went to see the show, and the salesman came over to me and said, "What have you got there?" He knew me by sight, but didn't know I was an artist. I said, "It's painting." He knew it was a painting. He said, "Who did it?" I said, I didn't know you did artwork. Let me take a look at it. And we unwrapped it, and without any premeditation, this was pure coincidence, and he took it back to the director of the gallery, who showed him this painting. And the director came out, and I learned later that it would take 2 years to get a date to see the guy
to come
even.
see your work.
And we chatted for a while, and he thought it was really good. And I got a call from him a couple of days later asking me if I had any other work available. And I had some Western paperbacks. So I brought them in, and we talked, and he offered a show, as I recall, which changed my career because I was with Hammer Galleries for...
So this is when you
I guess-
began showing in galleries, and some of the Western work you were painting
Right.
was now being
And
collected.
all of these paintings were really done as commissions or sold, or done to be made into prints and then sold by the galleries. It sort of reversed itself, instead of doing illustrations and getting the right subject matter that would work and be sold in a gallery, all of a sudden it reversed itself where I was painting just for the gallery. And then people were commissioning me.
And people were buying the paintings
Yeah,
then and not
right,
the
exactly. This was the beginning of
intellectual
a
property.
series, for want of a better word, I called Epic Paintings of America, where I try to do a series paintings of famous events in history. This is Custer's Last Stand, and I went out to the site on my own rather than via National Geographic sponsorship, did the research, and it was called by the historian out there the best and most exciting and accurate Custer ever done. But it was a very difficult road to go down because Custer had been done 1,000 times. And I went on to do the Fall of the Alamo. I don't know if we have this. This is not part of that series.
I want to go back to this because I think that was this there's the Fall of the Alamo.
Well, here's the Fall of the
Yeah.
Alamo.
Thank
And
you.
again, people had done it so many times. And then suddenly I ended up doing a painting for the 125th anniversary of the Battle of Gettysburg. And it's called the High Water Mark. I don't know if that would be
Well, I think
the one
it's
that's
coming along a little bit
coming up.
later.
But I somehow I bumped into, again, a coincidence. In doing my research, I met a publisher of limited edition prints in Gettysburg who was familiar with my work from Hammer Galleries and from several books that had come out on my work previously. And he said that he would publish this painting that didn't exist that I was doing the research on. And I did this battle scene that became a very famous picture or print, and it led to my Civil War career, which is not
Which we're going to look at in a
exclusive, but
moment. These Western pieces, you've been likened to Frederick Remington and Charles Russell. How did you get the authenticity and feel of the West of the century ago?
Well, I've been out there quite a few times. I literally rode over the Bighorn Mountains on horseback, 3 days and 3 nights camping out. And I happened to be, sounds crazy, a kid from Brooklyn growing up to be a woodsman or
You became a cowboy, is that it?
But I live wooded property, and I've, I do everything by hand. I cut with a bow saw and keep a wood burning stove going all winter, and split my own wood with a maul. And I on this trip over the Bighorn Mountains, they thought they had some greenhorn, I guess. We went over with someone that had invited me on this trip, and the wrangler, I guess, who took care of the horses when we made camp. One guy would take care of the horses, and the other would set up the tent. And I said, "I'll get the fire going," and they figured this was going to be a lost cause. They know they'd have to start the fire. So I very carefully set the fire up, and happened there was it was a previous campsite. And we were the first ones over the Bighorn Mountains that summer, July 15th. And the way you know is you get to snow, and there's no footprints. And anyway, I could see that they knew we picked out the site because it had been a site, but no one realized it had been used the night before. And I took some newspaper and very carefully prepared the ashes and put some pine needles down to make sure it was good. Then I said, "Hey, Carl, you got some matches?" I don't smoke. So he flipped me a matchbook and he said, "You sure that'll be enough, And I started to see a little bit of a wisp of smoke, and I knew I could start it with my hat. But I said, on second thought, Carl, forget it. I don't need any. I went like that. They never got over that one. But I gained a lot from those experiences that gave me a sense of actions that you could do and little stories within stories that you could do. Mm-hmm. And I went and I waded through rivers and whatever.
So you became the adventurer to
it was a lot of
study
fun.
these works. Now this was interesting. You
these are
took
all
on a
recent,
whole new genre.
Yeah, the farm series started as one picture that was commissioned by a gallery, interestingly, the first time I ever had been commissioned by a gallery. And it led to a bunch of farm paintings. of the old era, a horse-drawn era, that led to where, to this day, we have a Mort Künstler farm calendar that comes out every year, and along with several other.
Some more of your Western
These
works.
are some of the Westerns that were done for galleries.
Oh, we jumped
Another
to another
adventure
era here.
from my show. I had a first show at Hammer Galleries in '77, quite successful. Second one was in '79, and that was also sold out. And what really became a success from that, though, was that the chairman of the board of Rockwell International, who was an art collector, and was also on the board of Grand Central Galleries at the time, a rival of Hammer, actually, saw the show and asked me to go to dinner and asked me if I would be interested in painting pictures documenting the space shuttle. And at that time, no one had ever
you'd
heard
been
of it. I had
painting
not
the
heard of it.
West, the
I thought it was
settling
a
of the
plane that rode
West.
back and forth from Boston to New York.
Suddenly you're
he
flying
explained
into
to me, that I said, what's the name? Because everything had been Apollo and had different names. And it ended up as another big adventure. And we did about 30 or 40 pictures for them, only about maybe 6 or 10 finished oils, but a lot of studies and
remarkable.
sketches. And then we had the great excitement of seeing the first launch of the Columbia and the first touchdown, which took some doing because launched in Florida.
And then you had to get to California
had
to
get
record the
California, so
landing.
that was
Yeah.
good. This is
We're jumping around here a bit, but we're back to.
well, this is very meaningful for me. This is part of a series that I did for the National Guard Bureau here in Washington, and it hangs at the Pentagon today. And it's very dear to me because it's Theodore Roosevelt's charge up San Juan Hill. And I believe it's more accurate, I've been told it is, than Remington's version was. And Remington was there, went there, not to the battle, he didn't see the battle, knew Roosevelt. But for a number of reasons. But I also happened to live less than a mile from Sagamore Hill,
From
which
his
is
home,
Theodore
right.
Roosevelt's home. So I was very excited to get this as an assignment. I don't think that the major who gave me that assignment knew I lived
Didn't realize
that
that.
close to it. And they brought the actual pistol. The actual pistol I held in my hand.
Of course,
to do
he was a
that
great
painting.
outdoorsman and adventure.
It was fun.
adventurer
This is
as
part of
well.
that. This is the Oklahoma Land Rush, part of my epic series
Yeah,
that
I'm
you're
moving through
going
a
through
few so we
now.
can get to your Civil
And
War
again, another
series.
commission and leading to my Civil War era. This was 1980.
So how did your Civil War series start? You had gone from painting the West and painting all different aspects of American history and adventure, and then you received a call from PBS. Was that how
Yes,
your interest started?
via my agent. He changed, as I say, Lavity. This was the official logo for the CBS miniseries, The Blue and the Gray, that starred Gregory Peck and Stacy Keach, as I recall. And it was a symbolic kind of picture, and it led to a whole bunch of
This led
Civil
to
War
your
paintings that I
series, which
did.
we're
that
going to look at
And we had a
a
show at
series
Hammer
of.
Galleries. And this is the high water mark that I had talked about earlier, that I did after being inspired by that first logo. And that's where the real Civil War started, because it was made into a print that became very successful and very popular.
So how did you do your research for these
Well,
pictures?
I think I learned from National Geographic right from the start that if there's something to see, go see it. So I would always try to go. If there was nothing to see, then I wouldn't go, because it could be a city there and you'd have to reconstruct from maps or old engravings or whatever. But at Gettysburg, fortunately, it's been preserved, and that's what it's all about, is to preserve our history,
Right.
and so that we can learn from the past. And the Gettysburg battlefield is a very important element of preserving our history, and you read all the time about them looking to install gambling casinos there. They have a Harley Davidson. I have nothing wrong with Harley Davidson motorcycles, but I think Gettysburg should be known for why it is famous and
Well,
why
it's
is Gettysburg
really
and not as
considered a sacred space.
gambling center. So what we're talking about now is battlefield preservation, which also has other consequences, because everyone talks about Battle about preservation who's interested in it, but at the same time it aligns itself with conservation, because people don't realize this, but during the deer hunting season, which will be coming up this fall, it is acting to not only protect the fields the way they were 150 years ago, but the deer come out of the woods when the hunting season opens up in Gettysburg and browse in the fields in Gettysburg, where picket charged. And they go back to their safety zone, and they know it and sense it. So it's killing two birds with one stone. It's two great causes that should be entwined, and I don't know if they both recognize that.
They aren't married yet.
They don't seem to.
So this is a beautiful portrait of
This
Sojourner
is a painting
Truth.
I used Debbie as a model for it, and it started out as a paperback book cover. It was called, her name was Sojourner Truth, and there's one photograph of Sojourner Truth, and I chose to romanticize her and paint her as a young woman. The only photo is of her as about 70 or 75, and it's sort of an heroic
Very heroic.
version.
I
Well,
want
these
to,
were all parts of my Civil War paintings.
going
that
through the
are
seasons.
depicting-
Now, I want to
This
talk
is a
about
very-
this one a moment, because what really struck me about it was your early adventure paintings and the struggle and the striving that you see in this picture, pulling these horses and cannons through the mud. How did you envision this?
This was, again, a commission of the company that developed the land where this took place. This is called the Mud March. And it took place in Virginia, not far from here, actually, in the Fredericksburg area. And the Union Army went out in the winter, and they got hit by terrible weather and had to retreat. And this real estate developer had bought the prominent developer, had passed this through 7 or 8 different jurisdictions. He owned the property, and whatever anyone had an objection, he figured out a way to get it through, so that if it was a golf course that he wanted to put up, he protected the area and promoted it. So he preserved the trail that they actually traveled on and made it into a sightseeing tour if you played golf there. It was called the Cannon Ridge Golf Course.
Well, it doesn't look like a
whatever.
golf course
and
in this
I turned
picture.
it down when he asked me to paint it, because when he described the Mud March, it took me a year to figure out that I could make it into a dramatic picture. I just pictured mud color until I read about it and traveled that trail through the mud and got a feel for it. And then I realized that you can make it very dramatic with the lightning and the animals,
Straining
the
through that.
tremendous struggle. I consider it one of the best paintings I've ever done. I almost didn't
It's
do it.
magnificent.
And I almost didn't do it. It's sort of funny. I'll never forget when Hammer Galleries, that was commissioned through Hammer Galleries, was a client of theirs, and when he came in, I got the reaction I have always used as an expression now. He walked in, he looked at me, he went, "Wow," and I was so thrilled with that. So now I always look for a wow.
How large is it? What's the
It's
size?
a pretty big picture. It's about, I guess about 5 feet. I think it's probably
Yeah, I
60
think it's
inches,
important for
40,
people to understand
5
the
feet,
scale you paint in.
4 or 5 feet wide.
So now
This is another special commission.
This is a submarine that has just recently been found, if I'm
Yes,
correct in remembering.
yes. This is the Confederate submarine Hundley. That was the first submarine to succeed in sinking an enemy ship. And it became quite a celebrity, you might say, of the war. It was found intact in the bottom of Charleston Harbor after
Remarkable.
searching for 140 years or so. And this was, it was, again, visiting the site, learning everything about it. I was there, believe it or not, on the day that they actually opened the watch of the commander, Commander Dixon, who's looking at the watch because they had to catch the time for the tide to go out, for them to propel the boat. It was hand-propelled with a crank by 8 men in this manner, with a little tower, a conning tower with a little glass viewing thing. And unfortunately, it sunk after they sunk the Housatonic, the Union ship. And it was a mystery, but the beauty of it was that if you can call anything of this type beauty, but it sunk in its entirety, and it was always a mystery of how it sunk. And it was so preserved by the way it sunk that the sand seeped in and didn't allow the crustaceans and all
Preserved it.
kinds of sea to destroy it, to the point where the wooden bench that was all on one side of it, boat's about so high, all you could see about, I guess, the width of the stage here. That was the length of the boat, about this wide. And the wooden bench that the men sat on, the edges of the wood were sharp, and there was still white paint on it. And you could see the paint where it was worn away from their behinds.
I did not even know there were submarines during the Civil
Well,
War.
it was the
and
first
I think
one,
that's one
and
of the things
very successful and very unsuccessful.
I think we learned
And
from
they
your
will-
paintings, and we learn about history that maybe we didn't know about from the images you've created.
I learned a great deal about it. A note in this of interest is there's a little boat in the lower right foreground that had oysters in it. And Charleston did not suffer from hunger during the war because they were able to feed
They
off
had the oysters.
oysters and seafood. This is.
So well, just wrapping up your Civil War series, I think you have one example of a postage stamp that you created, which is a great tradition of artists and the U.S. Postal Commissions of commemorative stamps. And
It's the only stamp I ever did. And anyone that says that the government wastes a lot of money, I am sure they are correct, but they do not waste money on artists. And but it was a thrill and an honor.
moving right along, in case the Secret Service comes back now, Mort.
Right.
This was a magnificent memorial that you created, counterpoint, I think, to some of your Civil War pictures. And can you tell us about it? It's in Ohio.
Yes.
It's a little hard to see in this slide, but it's epic. It's the entire history of our American military, if I'm remembering correctly.
Yes, we got a call from the town, I guess, sponsored it, of Middletown, Ohio, and they were sponsoring a memorial to all of the people in peace or war who died from that area. And they had, it became a 60-foot long, 8-foot high black marble memorial. And those were two drawings that I did especially for it. They wanted to use a couple of my pieces in this design, and it was very amateurish, quite honestly, and I really didn't want to be associated with it. And they asked me if I would like to design it. And I said to myself, that sounds like a really interesting project. We'd never done anything like it before, but we figured out how to do it, and we made sort of illustration board replicas taped together with black board, and used all of our art and made room for the names. And it became a project that was a very worthwhile project from an artistic standpoint, certainly, and so much so that we all flew out to Middletown for the event, for the unveiling on July 4th. I don't remember the year, probably about 5 or 10 years ago.
Well, we have a series here that shows how you make a picture, and maybe you could walk us through briefly your study stages for this piece that I understand is one of your public's most favorite image of yours, Brief Encounters.
Right. Well, a lot of people think that these things just spring out from nowhere on a piece of canvas, but they really start with little scribbles, thumbnails we call them, and this is a sheet of tracing paper that's got some of those little thumbnails on it, and you can gradually, little by little, they look like scribbles to you, but I'm beginning to sort of get some ideas in mind. I do have in mind a particular building in the background that is in this town of Middleburg, and I had that in mind when I started it, and I came up with various ideas. It's not necessarily fictional, but it's an event that could have happened, certainly. And to do the research, I went to a museum on Long Island, as a matter of fact, not that far from my home, that had a sleigh in it of that period, and then came up with various ideas and angles and eye levels and sources of interest. you try to figure out every method that artists have used from time immemorial, such as perspective and linear design, light and dark, color, so that here you
Your
can see
building's
the
taking
problems
shape
that
here.
are coming up in a painting of this type, where I had to figure out that doesn't exist today, the porch that you see on that building. It existed in those days, though, and we knew that from, I forget, probably an old etching or something. And I had to work all of that out and use it to figure out how to get it done. We finally do a sketch with a grid on it that was shown previously, and then get that, when I say a grid, the sketch can be about so big with small squares, and then we make larger squares depending on how big the canvas is in the same proportion as the sketch.
So when you
that
say
everything-
"we," who's
yeah, I've
working
been
with you?
corrected that way all the time. When I say we, me, I do it all. Right, but I have an office, so I think we've got a team. And
Well,
the team is...
I'm sure you have assistants who purchase your canvases and your paints
Right,
and your
right,
supplies.
right. No,
and make
no,
sure
I
you
do
have
all of
everything you
the
need.
actual work. I don't have an apprentice or an assistant or anything of that nature.
Well, some artists do, so
I
I
know
wanted
that.
to be
I
clear
know
on
that.
how
No,
you did your
I
picture.
do it all. I found that...
So here's the finished piece with all the pieces put back together.
But you start out with little things, and we just showed part of the process.
But all these
of
ideas are
enlarging it up.
coming out of your imagination. You're not looking at an earlier artist's version, an etching or wood block print. You're
Right, I
coming
guess-
up with
I
your
guess so.
ideas, yes?
I guess so, yes. But I've learned I've stolen from all the artists of the past.
Well, that's a great tradition in art, is to borrow and be inspired by artists who painted before you. Who are your great heroes in art?
Well, very much the same heroes that Norman Rockwell, who was one of my heroes, had. Howard Pyle, Michelangelo, Rembrandt, Leonardo.
Some pretty big names there.
Yeah, well, he admired them all.
Yes.
He admired Howard Pyle especially. Also Arthur Rackham, who I admire greatly. So many present-day
Well, I
illustrators.
think artists are always looking at each other's work and getting inspired by new ideas.
Well, without question, I think that Norman Rockwell is thought of as in a very different way than the way I think of him. He is so good, and I think he is great because he is one of the great designers of all time. Everyone says he's a great storyteller, but people do not realize that the head is framed around a window, or he uses perspective. The way Leonardo da Vinci painted The Last Supper, it's one-point perspective, and the one point is right between the eyes of Jesus, and every visual line leads to it. Well, if you study this, you begin to learn, and Rockwell was such a great designer of putting light against dark, making the most important point in the picture, the brightest point. It would be like taking a stage full of Rockettes dressed in white and having one in red in the center, and your eye goes to it. You put her on the end, your eye's
Your
still
eyes
going
gonna
to
go there.
So that's use of color. Perspective could be, or sunlight, as in this picture where the light is just hitting the flag. It doesn't look too good. Here, I don't know if we can tell that way, but it's a lot more dramatic on the original picture. And I mentioned Michelangelo.
Well, I think that's an important thing, that artists have to think about the composition and the layout of their pictures very deliberately and very carefully. You make it look so easy when the piece is all done, but you are directing our attention to certain areas on the canvas.
Well, a perfect example is right here with that puddle, designed very deliberately. I know that it rained the night before. How can I use that information? And that puddle is an arrow pointing to my center of interest, and the figure accepting the sword of surrender at Yorktown is very deliberately silhouetted against the sky. The flags are very deliberately silhouetted against the sky. And the only other figure really silhouetted is George Washington, who refused to surrender because Cornwallis did not show up to surrender personally and claimed he was ill. And this gets me more to present day. This is a painting that I'm sort of starting to do some George Washington. There'll be a future book coming out in 2014 on my Revolutionary War or New Nation period. And this is Washington coming home to Mount Vernon after the war is over. And again, it's all imagination of what you feel must have happened or had happened or probably happened. I very rarely will go to another possibly. It's probable in most cases. This is another painting that was commissioned by a client of Hammer Galleries of Washington at Valley Forge, where von Steuben is training the troops. And
that leads us to
and leads us to
perhaps your most epic painting that just was released last year, finished last year.
Yes, they were great.
Or maybe this winter, just recently.
And I believe that the man that commissioned this painting is
here. Oh, it is a masterpiece. It's a masterpiece.
And it came about where I really didn't want to do the picture. And he said, but you'll do it the right way. And I said, how am I going to do a picture like that? That's so iconic. It's impossible. And he said, you'll figure a way. I said, well, there's no way I'm going to do that unless it's commissioned. He said, I commission it. Sort of like Theodore Roosevelt when he formed the national parks. I so do whatever he said. But what's very interesting about this...
Well, it must have been intimidating to do a modern-day version of Washington crossing the Delaware.
Well, I think that this is... I don't know if there's anyone that could argue against it, any point that's in this picture, because everything is very carefully thought out, including the men on the left side of the boat as we look at it, who would have been kneeling to form a natural railing, because they didn't have railings on those ferries. And they ferried across cannon and horses. And my reasoning was that he went across on a boat like that with a cable and poling. And I learned this from visiting the site again, which is standard procedure for me at this point. And Tom Swazi went with me on that trip. He was so curious and interested in the subject matter that he knows, I think, more than I do, certainly as much as I do about it at this point. But what's also more interesting, and something that Tom Swazi doesn't know, is that the last advertising painting I did in 1981 was crossing the Delaware. And I found that out later, and this was an ad for NYNEX, or one of the phone companies, and it's a sort of a comic takeoff.
So we find out that everything comes around. And so tell us what's next for Mort Künstler.
Well, what's next is really strange, because we received a call from a worldwide agency, an advertising agency in London. They have offices around the world. It's an American company. I have signed a non-disclosure agreement, so I can't say exactly who it is, but they called asking if they could use my early men's adventure illustrations and a select group, we have hundreds, if not 1,000, as part of an advertising campaign for a vodka. And it's with a comic kind of a twist.
Maybe this is inspired by Mad Men, a bit retro of going back to
your... And they wanted this macho kind of a look, and it was kind of like saving...
the damsel in distress with the bear.
And the catch line on the billboard is going to read, save more women, drink such and such vodka, or a scuba diver with a spear, wrestle more sharks before breakfast, drink such and such vodka.
So we're looking at a contemporary warrior here.
So now, believe it or not, they asked me for certain details that they couldn't find, and asked if I would do the painting for them with this particular expression where the guy is looking right at you and he's suffered through hardship and he's done all of this to, I guess, persevere. And one of the lines on the billboard is, just, and the picture of the bottle. And that's going to spin out in a year or so in the United States. It'll be all over the world. And I found I became a very good businessman, because when they talked about it and I was quiet on the phone, the price went up to where they made me an offer I couldn't refuse. And I have had such fun doing them. I've done 7 now. And they take about a day or so.
Well, fun to visit your earlier
yeah,
career.
I can't believe it that I'm painting pictures imitating my style of,
Imitating yourself.
of the 50s and 60s.
Well, Mort, thank you so much for this conversation, and thank you for the legacy that you have created for our country and for all of us, and to be able to learn history from and to really feel your passion that comes through your
I
work.
guess I have a little too much of it. I'm answering the questions before you ask them, I guess. I don't seem to be able to control myself, but I'm not
Thank you, Mort.
very good at this.
You were great.
Thank you.
You were great.
Thank you.